Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian is speaking.
Wales, whilst ever Victoria is in the situation it's in, it automatically puts us at risk, because we know no matter how strict you are at the borders, no border is complete, no border is impenetrable, as Queensland themselves found out and as we've found as well. But I do want to thank the thousands and thousands of people coming forward for testing. The high rates of testing and people following the health advice has meant that in New South Wales we have been able to hold the line. And of course we want this to continue. We want us to be able to be on a path where we can continue to have a good balance of taking care of the virus, keeping people safe, but also obviously going about our daily lives and supporting people into jobs, especially those who have lost their jobs. And keeping this right balance is integral for our well-being in the next little while, and that's why the next few weeks are absolutely critical. Today, Dr. Chant and I are going to strongly recommend that people wear masks in certain circumstances. There are 4 key areas where we want people to wear masks. Firstly, if you're in an enclosed space and you can't guarantee social distancing, such as on public transport, such as when you're buying your groceries, you should be wearing a mask. We also would like to see more staff who are customer-facing wearing masks, whether they're in hospitality venues or whether they're in retail. Whenever they're facing customers, we want them, we strongly recommend that they wear masks. If you're attending a place of worship, we want you to wear a mask. If you're attending a church, a synagogue or a mosque, we would like you to wear a mask. And finally, if you are in an area where there's high community transmission or a number of cases, we want you to wear a mask. So they're the 4 key areas where we're strongly recommending people wear masks. I want to stress it's not compulsory, but it is a strong recommendation from health, given where we are in the pandemic, given the risk posed from Victoria and given the rate of community transmission in New South Wales, that whether you're in an enclosed space and you can't guarantee social distancing, you should be wearing a mask. If you're a staff member, and we know a lot of companies have already provided that advice to their employees, but if you're in an organisation or an enterprise which is customer facing and you're having a lot to do with customers, we would like to see you wearing a mask. If you're going to a place of worship, we'd like to see you wearing a mask. And also, if you live in an area where there's known cases and there's community transmission, we would like you to wear a mask. Now, this strong recommendation we're asking occur from tomorrow. Again, it is not compulsory, but can I thank the community for taking the advice we've provided. I myself, next time from tomorrow when I go grocery shopping, I will be wearing a mask. If I was to catch a train or a bus, I would choose to wear a mask. And if my community had high rates or increasing rates of community transmission, I would be wearing a mask. So these are recommendations to keep all of us safe, and they're recommendations to make sure we keep New South Wales in the position we're in. I can't stress enough how critical the next few weeks are. When we learned of how critical the situation was in Victoria, we said, you know, New South Wales would require extra vigilance over a 4 to 6 week period. We're about halfway through that period. We are holding the line and doing okay, but I can't stress enough that the next few weeks will make or break us in terms of the way we get through this pandemic. And that's why I'm urging everybody to take this advice and to make sure that you're well equipped, well aware, well informed to deal with the situation that is arising. Please note that the health advice is evolving. I know it might sound concerning when there's a number of venues being identified where that people may have been exposed, but that's a good thing. It means our health detectives are doing their job. It means we're able to get information out to the community almost immediately. As soon as the health detectives work out that a case or a suspected case has been exposed at a particular venue, the fact we're getting that information out there is a positive. But please also know that once those venues have been deep cleaned, once those venues have been deemed to be COVID safe, it is okay to go back to those venues. So the information we give out is to make sure everybody is aware, everybody gets tested. And as Dr. Chant will explain, wearing a mask is your 4th line of defence. It does not mean you shouldn't social distance, quite the opposite. Wearing a mask is the 4th line of defence. The 1st line of defence is if you even have the slightest symptom or you've been asked to get tested and stay isolated for 14 days. Secondly, you have to social distance no matter where you are, 1.5 metres, no exceptions for anybody. You have to keep that social distance. You have to keep up your hand hygiene. These are the things you need to do regardless of whether you're wearing a mask or not, and the mask is actually the next line of defence. It shouldn't replace any of those other things. You have to be just as careful. but a mask is that fourth line of defence. And so can I urge everybody to please keep doing what you're doing, because the vast majority of our citizens are doing a wonderful job in being alert, in being extra cautious, in minimising their activity. And I'm pleased to hear that people are taking that extra level of caution, because as I said, if we get through the next few weeks, the way in which we are, we have very good prospects of having a better experience during the pandemic than otherwise. And our geographic proximity to Victoria is always a concern. That's why we need to take these extra measures, and we need to make sure that we break the back of any community transmission chains that we may not know about. I want to thank everybody for their vigilance, in particular the health detectives who have gone over and above. I mean, our health officials are doing an outstanding job, and so is the police, in making sure that all of us do the right thing. And can I stress how important it is for all of us to continue taking that advice and doing the wrong thing. Can I also say, in terms of mask wearing, obviously those most vulnerable should consider wearing a mask at all times. If you're of a particular age group or have a co-illness or a comorbidity, as we say, or highly vulnerable, then obviously you should consider wearing a mask at all times. And I've certainly noticed in the community that additional mask wearing, which is a very positive sign. But we know that during a pandemic, governments have to keep doing their business of government and doing what's important. And today I'm really pleased to be with Minister Bronnie Taylor. We're at the site now. We'll see our state's first purpose-built mental health unit for mums and bubs, for women and their babies, women who are experiencing perinatal mental health issues. And we know how common that is, and especially in acute cases. And to think that they'll be having a dedicated mental health unit at RPA, the first one of its kind in its state, to take care of mums and bubs during that critical period is really something extremely positive, and Minister Taylor will outline further details on that. But I want to thank her and her health department for supporting the government's vision and making sure we have acute services purpose-built for mothers and babies during a very difficult time in their lives. And especially now, we know that all those key milestones in life, whether it's having a baby or whether it's getting married or whether it's mourning the love of a lost one, become even more acute, become even more sensitive. And please...
This is where we farewell viewers on ABC TV. You can continue watching the press conference on the ABC's news channel.
We'll speak about the purpose-built unit, and then we'll take your questions.
Thank you, Premier. So there were 12 new cases of COVID were diagnosed in the 24 hours to 8 p.m. last night, bringing the total number of cases to 3,595. And that was in the context of 22,427 tests. Of the new cases, one was a traveller in hotel quarantine. 3 cases attended the Apollo restaurant on the 25th of July. 2 cases attended the Mounties Club in Mount Pritchard on the 23rd of July. 5 cases are close contacts of known cases, and 1 case is locally acquired with no known source identified, and that was in a childcare worker. In relation to that case, that is a case who attended the Advanced Early Learning Centre in Merrylands, whilst infectious, on the 27th, 28th and 29th of July. And a second case has been reported this morning in another staff member at that centre. The centre is currently closed for cleaning, close contact tracing is underway, and investigations as to the source of that infection in that person is underway. 1 case counted in yesterday's numbers attended the Toronto courthouse, the Toronto Drug Court, on Monday the 27th of July. And as a precaution, cleaning of the courthouse will take place today, but all close contacts have been identified and are being contacted this morning. But as a precaution, anyone who attended the Toronto courthouse between 7 a.m. and 2 p.m. on Monday the 27th of July should watch for any symptoms, and should, even if mild symptoms develop, must self-isolate and immediately seek urgent COVID testing. 1 case attended the Canterbury Hurlstone Park RSL on Monday the 27th of July from 6:30 p.m. to 8 p.m. Patrons and staff of the Canterbury Hurlstone Park RSL who attended at the same time should monitor for symptoms, and again, if symptoms develop, should immediately self-isolate and present themselves for testing. happy to take any other questions later, but also just wanted to report, sadly, as reported yesterday, that there was an 83-year-old who had COVID, sadly passed away yesterday, and that was reported yesterday. My condolences to the family. In general messages, I'm urging the community at this time to continue to come forward for testing, particularly those members of the community who live and reside in Greater Western Sydney and the Potts Point region. We need to mop up any community transmission that has occurred as associated with those seeding events and clusters. And for that, I need the community to continue to come forward for testing. I can't stress this enough, that over the next 2 to 3 weeks, it's essential that we continue to have high rates of testing across the state, not only in those areas, which I've particularly called out, but across the state. And that will give us assurance that we're not missing undetected chains of transmission. Because as the Premier indicated, whilst we do have our borders closed, there are always, they can never be 100% foolproof. And therefore we do need vigilance, we do need people complying with our public health measures, and we do also need those high rates of testing. In relation to the mask wearing recommendation, I think the Premier has covered all of those aspects. So we do strongly encourage mask wearing as the fourth line of defence. As the Premier indicated, it's important that the message around not going to work when you're sick or unwell is still heard and responded to in workplaces across the state. It's essential that people continue to maintain that social distancing, hand hygiene, and then the fourth line of defence is mask wearing. We're particularly concerned about mask wearing in the settings where we know transmission is occurring, and they're settings indoors, where people, for whatever reason, are unable to socially distance at all times. So the sorts of venues we're calling out are those where people are most likely to breach that 1.5 metre distance. And so they're things like supermarkets, where you might inadvertently have to crowd for a short period, notwithstanding the work the supermarkets are doing to maintain that social distancing. Similarly in hospitality, and why we're focusing particularly on hospitality workers is often notwithstanding some of the technology that's been introduced, which means that people can order remotely from their tables, there is still a lot of customer interactions where, particularly in noisy venues, staff have to come within that breach of 1.5 to hear their customers order. So they would be circumstances where we're particularly asking for hospitality workers to wear masks. And similarly in places of worship, I'd like to acknowledge the work that churches and other places of worship have put in place to maintain social distancing. But despite that, we know that it's difficult to maintain that at all times, and that congregants may collect at points outside the venues. And because of that, we're urging people to wear masks in, again, those indoor settings. So please, we also want people to get out and about and enjoy the beautiful weather we're having at the moment. So please, this is a time, maintain your social distancing when you're out and about. You don't necessarily need to wear a mask when you're out and about, but if you know that you're going to go into situations where you're not going to be able to maintain that social distancing, we'd again encourage you to wear masks.
Well, thank you very much, Premier, and thank you very much, Dr. Chant, for everything you're doing, but most of all, that how proud we are to have a health system that we do in New South Wales. I realise we have very big mountains to climb, but gee, it's terrific to have all of the work that everyone out there is doing every single day in their clinical responsibilities, so thank you. Today is really a great day for the families and the community of New South Wales, because today we are announcing that for the first time ever, we are going to have a mother and babies unit here at RPA. It's going to have 8 beds, but what it means, the most important thing that it means, is that a mother is able to bring her infant baby with her if she is experiencing an acute episode of her psychiatric illness. We know that for women, the time of when they're pregnant and that year after they've had their baby, that they are more likely to experience a mental illness. That is their most at-risk time for them in terms of a mental illness. And what we also know is that it's so important in those early moments and in that first year of life particularly, where a woman and a mother bonds with her baby. So we know that if you're going through a really tough time in terms of your mental health and you require an admission to a facility, when we have this up and running by the end of by next year, it means that you can come here with your baby and you can be treated. You can have access to the care that you need at the right time and in the right place. It makes me very proud to be the New South Wales Minister for Mental Health, to be able to announce this here today. As I said, this is the first one in New South Wales. We're planning on doing another one further down the track at Westmead. This is about making sure that mothers and their families have access to the care that they need. I'm really pleased that Jen and Arlo are here with us today to be able to share their story. I thank her for her courage and being able to do this today in front of all these cameras and all these people. It speaks volumes about her, but it speaks volumes about the fact that people who need these services are willing to stand up and say that's absolutely what we have to do. So it's a great day, as I said, for families and for the community of New South Wales.
Arlo's been so well.
Yeah, he's been so good, hasn't he?
Yeah, so my name's Genevieve Whitlam. About 6 months ago, 1 week after giving birth to baby Arlo, I was in the depths of a postnatal psychosis caused from a raging infection and lack of sleep. I have no pre-existing mental health conditions, so I've never experienced it before, and I found myself needing hospitalisation. So I spent several weeks in the public health system and before being transferred to a private mums and bubs ward, where I was able to bond with Arlo finally and receive the specialist treatment that I required. So today's announcement is just such an exciting development in the treatment space for people experiencing severe mental health issues. Thank you.
Jen, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing. It's really special. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thanks, Arlo. Thank you.
A question on the mask issue. Given that Dr. Grant said that health is focusing on areas where there has been settings where transmission is occurring, noting that most of the transmission has been in restaurants and pubs, should people at these venues wear a mask where practical? And just on the timing, what's changed between today and last week when you said that anyone, no matter where you are, if you can't maintain a 1.5 metre social distance, should be wearing a mask?
Well, obviously we've been talking about masks for several weeks, but obviously the consistent situation in Victoria gives us cause for alarm in terms of the potential for further seeding into New South Wales. And also it is part of our risk mitigation strategy. As you all know, for a number of weeks, Dr. Chant, the Health Minister, and myself have been talking about the high alert state that we're in and how critical it is for us to make sure that we get through the next few weeks by holding the line as we are. And that is part of our what we call risk mitigation strategy. So in the first instance, we restricted the number of people that could attend particular events in these high-risk areas. And now we're going the next stage of saying how else can we reduce the risk of community transmission, and how can we really break the back of this current chain which is coming through New South Wales. And this is the next stage in the evolving health advice, and it's consistent with what we've said before, but we've certainly honed in on those areas that are high risk. Every day that our contact tracers learn more and more about the virus, every day our epidemiologists give us greater advice on what the virus is doing and what these particular strains are doing. And so I please ask everybody to be on notice. The health advice is evolving. We're evolving based on the situation in New South Wales faces, but we also can't pretend that we are geographically separated from Victoria. We're not. There is a border there. We have closed the border, but as most states around the nation know, that is not 100% guarantee that cases still won't come across or cases can't create seeding, especially from New South Wales residents or residents from other states that are going back to their home states. So we do all need to continue to be on high alert. And please note, even around venues, the health advice is evolving. So initially they might make certain recommendations around a venue where an exposure may have been occurred, and during the course of the day or the next day, that advice is evolving. But please know that New South Wales has been served extremely well by the advice we've had. Can I thank all of the government agencies who've been working together. This has been an incredible team effort. It's not, of course, it's health are at the forefront, but it's our police and emergency services, education, all of our key agencies, transport, all of our key agencies have been working together. And that's why I can proudly say that in New South Wales, we are definitely working together, and all of us are in this together. And the next few weeks are make or break for us. We had said initially the next 4 to 6 weeks. As soon as we were aware of what was going on in Victoria, we knew 4 to 6 week period would be very critical for New South Wales. We're about halfway through that. And the fact that we're in the position we're in, whilst it's concerning, does still demonstrate we've been able to hold the line. And health has done a brilliant job in ring fencing those strains that we've been able to identify. But we know that the advice is one thing, and we do also rely on the public to do the right thing with that advice. And I'm deeply grateful that people have done that. And we asked people to modify their behaviour and their activity. We asked people to consider where they were going. And that's also been taken on board, because I think all of us know that if we work a bit harder now, we'll be better off in the medium to long term, and that's what all of us want. And I think we are all getting the message that if we work a bit harder now, if we take every bit of advice we can to reduce the risk of spreading the virus, well, then that means we have a much better chance of getting through this pandemic in a better way than other states, unfortunately, have gone down. Well, because there are always exceptional circumstances, and we have faith in people taking the advice. We have faith in people following the recommendations we're making, and we also have to make sure that we make decisions and give that advice based on what is happening in New South Wales. We can't compare ourselves to other states. We can't compare ourselves to other jurisdictions. Every jurisdiction has its own set of unique circumstances. Our proximity to Victoria is unique. The size of our population is unique. The way that we interact is unique, and therefore we have to base decisions on that. And the health advice to date in New South Wales has been second to none anywhere in the world. And I'm proud of the advice we get and the way in which our government's been able to implement that advice. I would be completely comfortable with that. But please know that in some of the high-risk venues, it's very difficult to ask people to wear a mask when they're eating. So therefore, if we're going to allow people to frequent those places in a COVID-safe way, you have to accept that when people are having a meal, you can't wear a mask in those circumstances. And that's why our advice is very strong in relation to staff having the mask when they're customer-facing. But our health advice even goes down to the minutest level of detail. If you actually look at the COVID safe plans we have in for businesses, these are all outlined in that. But even how loud people speak in a venue can affect how contagious the virus is, because the louder you speak, the further the droplets go, which is why I'm always keen to make sure there's a distance around here, because droplets obviously go further the louder someone speaks. And I remember early on, people laughed at us when we said the health advice was no singing, no mingling, no dancing. There's a reason for this. It's based on science, it's based on the health advice. And what our job is to make sure that as soon as we feel confident that something is based on science and data, that we articulate that to the community as soon as we can.
Maybe last time you...
Yeah, I was actually just speaking to one of the health advisors in charge of managing that quarantine process, and certainly I will say that our overseas quarantine again has done an incredible job here in New South Wales, but we are considering the situation with returning people from Victoria. At the moment we require them to self-isolate, but we will continue to consider what measures we take if we need to take any further measures. Well, look, there are a number of things that we could consider, but it has to be, again, against the risk, and it also depends in large part as to what the Victorian Premier announces in relation to whether or not they proceed to the next stage of lockdown. So we will respond according to what the Victorian situation is in the next few days.
Bernie, last time you spoke with us, you said that people in hotspot areas or areas with increased transmission should reduce their mobility. What does that mean?
It essentially means when you know that there's community transmission in your area where you live, we do ask people to consider what they need to do. So if you don't need to go to the local hospitality venue every night of the week, well, we refrain from that activity. Reducing your mobility means considering what you should be doing or what you can be doing to reduce the risk of the virus spreading, either by you unintentionally giving it to others or by others unintentionally giving it to you. But I can't say strongly enough that everybody who leaves their home in New South Wales at the moment has to assume that either they have the virus or the people they're interacting with has the virus. That's why you need to make sure you maintain your social distancing, have hand hygiene, and also in particular, if you're going to a supermarket or you're catching public transport, that you do consider wearing a mask.
So does that mean that for those areas with community transmission, we're asking people to voluntarily stay at home unless they have to leave their house for one of the reasons?
Well, all we've said is please note, we've been very direct, and I've been saying this for the last few weeks, we've been very direct in explaining to people what the high-risk venues are, what the high-risk activity is, and we're just saying to people, be careful, make sure that if you're going to any venue, it's COVID safe, that if you're partaking in any activity which is over and above what you would normally do outside of your work and essential travel, that you consider what that activity is, especially if it's in a community where we know there's been active cases. But again, can I stress, and Health gives this advice all the time, there is no reason why you can't get back to a venue once that deep clean has occurred, once the COVID safe plan has been validated by our health experts. There's no reason why you can't go back to that venue, but all of us need to be extra cautious. All of us need to know that waiting outside in a queue is as dangerous potentially as being in close proximity inside a venue. So it's just being aware, it's just knowing that we have to live with this pandemic. None of us know when the end date is, but what I do know is life will be much better for all of us if we do the right thing now and put in the hard yards now. If we put in the hard yards now, we will avoid what Victoria is going through, and that's our aim. I really want to extend my empathy to the Victorian Premier and all the citizens of Victoria, because the situation they're in is not a good one, and honestly our hearts and thoughts go to them, because we know what it's like to be in lockdown. We know how difficult it is, how much it can impinge on your mental and physical well-being, and I just want to say that it's in all of our state's interests to support Victoria during this time. If Victoria gets its situation under control, it augurs better for the rest of the nation. Sorry, who hasn't asked a question yet? I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. Oh, I'm sorry, I don't know about that example, but certainly if it was a marketplace where people are purchasing food and other things, I would expect next weekend everybody or most people will be wearing a mask when they do that. So this is part of the risk mitigation, because sometimes you might leave your house with the best intentions of keeping social distancing. Others might not be as respectful of your personal space, and that's why if you feel you're going to be in a situation where there will be some crowds, that not everybody can maintain social distancing all of the time, that you should be wearing a mask. And that's why we've certainly upped the health advice today in terms of strongly recommending people in those situations to wear a mask, especially in those hot spots. Dr. Chant today strongly said to everybody in Western and Southwestern Sydney to keep coming forward to getting tested. Thank you to those that have. Our testing rates, remember how we used to say 8,000 is a good rate to get tested every day? We're now at around 24 or 25,000 tests a day. So the people of New South Wales have really come forward in a fantastic way, better than we could have anticipated. And we need to keep those rates of testing high to keep making sure we draw out any of that community transmission we may not have picked up, that we make sure we draw out anyone who may have been exposed at a venue so that we can announce that and make people cautious and aware. And that's why to date we've announced the restrictions we have around number of people attending events, and that's why today we're increasing our advice on strongly recommending people to wear masks in certain situations. But especially I want to thank those more vulnerable in the community who've been wearing masks pretty much every time they leave the house, and I think that's a good policy to have. Oh, sorry, I'll come back to you, Daniel. Yeah. Well, already I know that many of those workplaces offer masks to their workers if they want. I know certainly many sectors of the public service have that available for staff if staff feel they want to have that protection.
A slight extension on that, is there any plan to make masks available from a government stockpile for people who might be low income?
Yeah, well. No, that's a good question, and obviously Health has provided advice on how you can make masks and what is a safe way of doing that. Please, you might all remember a couple of months ago when we announced the call to action to have some local companies retool. We've had a number of local suppliers now providing those masks that are accessible for daily use. And to date, the suppliers have been reasonable throughout the state. I'm confident that whoever at this stage wants to get a mask can, a disposable one, which you use for for one outing and then dispose of, are relatively accessible financially. So there's certainly supply chains that have established now in New South Wales that we didn't have before. Obviously, they're not as they're distinct from the surgical mask which our health professionals have to wear because they are dealing directly with potential COVID cases. But in terms of what is regarded as safe for New South Wales residents, certainly my experience is they're readily accessible, and certainly I noticed my local chemists or pharmacists had them in ample supply. Sorry, Alex was next. Oh, you got. Oh, sorry. Yep. Sorry. Well, I think it's up to private businesses to determine what they feel is safe for their staff and for their patrons. And I completely respect and support businesses for taking whatever decisions they take over and above the health advice. What my job as Premier is to make sure that I convey to the community in the strongest possible terms the best advice that Dr. KerryChant and her team of experts give to me. But if any business wants to go over and above that advice, that's a matter for them. And I'd especially like businesses to consider their situation if they happen to have older clientele or older people who are their patrons. I would expect that some businesses would go beyond the health advice if they felt that they had a particular vulnerable cohort amongst their customer or client base, but it's completely up to them. If anybody, I mean, I'll often go beyond the health advice because I'm a cautious person, but if anybody wants to go over and above the health advice, that's a matter for them. And we encourage everybody at this time to be as cautious as possible because, as I said, the next few weeks are critical. I've been very pleased with the progress we're making, but we are still in a dangerous position. It's still very high alert. It's still very easy for a strain of the virus to get hold and to get out of control, and that's what we're trying to prevent every day. And I know that, you know, in a matter of seconds we give you the daily update of the number of cases, but please know behind every single case there's hours and hours of interviews and contact tracing, putting out alerts. It is a daily slog keeping on top of this, and that's why I'm so grateful to everybody who's working literally around the clock. I won't tell you how many times Dr. Chan and I and others communicate on a daily basis, but that's the vigilance we need to make sure we stay on top of it. And it's at least 20 government agencies, whether it's the police or emergency services, transport, education. It is a big deal just every day to make sure we try and stay on top of this. But all of us have to have that vigilance, that sense of urgency. If we get through the next 2 or 3 weeks, our prospects of having a good quality of life all round during the course of the pandemic are much more positive than what they are today. Well, I think what's important for us as a government is not to take our eye off what are important issues. And of course I'm heartened by that, but the critical issue for us is making sure that not only do we reduce homelessness or street homelessness, but that we keep supporting them through those wraparound services which allow people to have that good quality of life. But we also know that there are a number of priorities that governments can't take the eye off, irrespective of a pandemic. We have to make sure that the wheels of government are turning, our infrastructure projects are actually going very well, our construction industry is going well, because we need to create jobs. I do worry about what happens when JobKeeper ends. I do worry about what happens when 25% of your economy in terms of Victoria won't be available to the rest of Australia, and that puts additional pressure on New South Wales. So there are all these things we need to worry about, but there are always silver linings. There are always heartening stories about how we've been able to support those most vulnerable, and that will continue. In today's announcement about the Mums and Bubs unit is another example, where we'll be, for the first time in our state, building a dedicated acute service for mental health for women who are going through that perinatal mental health crisis. Ashley hasn't asked a question.
They're not increasing, we're still keeping around that 20 cases and under, but is this announcement today about masks sort of a sign to the community that you just can't keep doing what we've been doing in the past couple of weeks to stop this virus spreading?
Well, this is definitely an additional measure we've put in to reduce the risk, because not only, remember that the National Cabinet's advice is we want to reduce the incidence of community transmission as much as possible. So it's not just about controlling the spread, but it's also breaking those chains, which mean that direct contact members of a household or people who have been exposed in a venue are getting the disease. So it's really about breaking the back of this strain, and also, as Dr. Chan, and I use her word, I quite like the mopping up. So we know where there's been cases of community transmission, and how can you ring fence those areas and mop that up to make sure that all the various mini outbreaks have subsided and don't pose a risk to the community. So the additional recommendation around masks means that we can continue with the economic activity we have. We can continue so long as we have to accept and understand that it's the fourth line of defence. It's still important for the social distancing, the hand hygiene. If you have the slightest symptom, get tested and stay home for 14 days. If you've been exposed at a venue where the recommendation is to get tested and stay home, please follow that advice. I couldn't think of anything more horrible than causing someone else's death because I decided not to take the advice. I couldn't live with myself, and I don't want anyone else having that guilt. So please know the health advice is for you, for your loved ones, but also protecting everybody who might unintentionally be exposed because of our own personal actions.
Just on that, are you stepping up checks in terms of people who should self-isolate?
Well, our compliance regime has already been pretty tough, and the police have been fantastic, can I say. Most recently, I think even before the Victorian outbreak, we always knew that this month would be a key one in relation to compliance, because a lot of businesses were obviously increasing their activity. So can I thank the police, can I thank all our regulators for stepping up on that compliance, making sure people are doing the right thing, and help themselves often check up on cases to make sure progress is well, that their health conditions are okay. And generally speaking, the rate of compliance by people who've had to self-isolate has been very good. I think some categories of businesses can work harder in being COVID safe, and the police certainly have been very vigilant in that regard. And I'm pleased with the work the police have been doing in conjunction with our regulators, who have really stepped up on that compliance. I'm sorry? Well, that was the last question. Quick question, yeah.
So can I just clarify? Sorry, can I clarify? How many cases have been identified that New South Wales is not able to link those cases to a known cluster? Is it 7 or is it 8?
So our epidemiology report, which is on our website, provides the data for the few weeks before. So from memory, and this would be, there were about 3 cases in that week to I think the 25th of July. This week we will report the numbers, and I'm happy to get that for you. But all I'm commenting on is that the one case that was locally acquired yesterday, in yesterday's numbers we were unable to link. What's important is these numbers do change around, because sometimes we have cases and then a few days later we actually find that piece of the puzzle that actually links those cases. And so the number of unlinked cases does change, but we do comment on that every day. And in our epidemiology report we do provide those numbers, and obviously that's a very key indicator we look at, because it means that there are chains of transmission that we potentially have not got control of. So you're right to focus on that issue. Could I just make a couple of other comments? Just in relation to one of the other cases, they did attend the Nita shopping centre in Fairfield on a number of times between the 23rd of July and the 30th of July, including the Sol Patterson's Chemist, the Woolworths and the Fresco Juice Bar. We do think that the risk to others is incredibly low. Anyone who's visited the shopping centre on these days should monitor for symptoms, and if they develop, seek testing. I would also just like to say that in relation to masks, it's important to understand that some people cannot tolerate a mask. So if you've got respiratory difficulties, there might be some issues where wearing a mask actually is very terrifying, and you're not going to be tolerating those masks. So that's why it's an adjunct. You know, mask wearing is an adjunct. We've told you the settings where we're seeing transmission, and basically they're settings where you can't maintain that 1.5 metre, and they're largely indoor settings. And so what we're trying to do is balance the fact that there is no silver bullet. What we need to do is give you a range of options. And I also want to say that a number of businesses have done other things. So for instance, if you go into the bank, there's a plastic screen that protects the tellers from interactions. You'll notice that there's often physical barriers where you can't actually get closer than 1.5 metre to the shop assistants. So again, mask wearings complement a range of other measures, and I think what we're trying to do is give the community information upon which they can base their actions, as well as support businesses make those nuanced decisions about what is the best way to keep their staff safe as well as patrons.
Thank you.
So our message really has not changed. Whilst we're emphasising this, and I think probably over the last 2 weeks you can see how we've incorporated the language around the masks as our fourth line of defence. What we're highlighting is that it's the mask wearing in indoor settings where you can't socially distance. And members of the community know that. However, we're also saying, think about when you travel on public transport. Think about how you're getting to your destination. If you know that the bus is going to be crowded, then also consider working from home, or also maybe taking a later bus or getting flexible work hours. So again, the community is actually incredibly responsive, and we're trying to explain to them about how the lines of defence work, and then they can make the decisions for them about what suits their particular circumstances. I think it's an example of something that when we talk about supermarkets, we're talking generally about activities that people have to do. So, you know, you have to go in and buy the shoes for the child, you have to go in and buy some critical clothing, or you have to go out and about. So we're just trying to give supermarkets as an example of something that I think would resonate with everyone as an example, rather than giving a long list. But what we're meaning is places where you know from your experience. I know that if I go to the supermarket at 11 o'clock at night in my local supermarket, I don't see anyone and there's no issues for me at any point in time. Whereas I know if I go to the hustle and bustle of another place that I sometimes get to, that's going to be a little bit hard to always maintain my social distancing. So that's an area where I would make that decision. But people actually know know their local communities, know where they get out and about, and we're trying to give them the information to make the best choices for themselves and their families.